to the Global Leadership Podcast, where leaders of all sorts come to grow and expand their influence in a healthy and holistic way. Because we know that when a leader gets better, everyone wins. I'm your host, Whitney Putnam, and I have been so excited about sharing this episode with you because we are giving you a sneak peek of one of our summit speakers for this year, Tasha Eurich. You guys are going to love her because guess what? She talks about something I am sure we are all navigating, how to be more resilient. But before we go on, what comes to mind when you hear the word resilient? Is it perseverance, white knuckling it, gutting it out, or endurance? It seems like over the past 5 years, the concept of resilience has definitely entered the cultural conversation. But what if I told you that there's more to navigating the challenges of life than mere resilience? In fact, some of our discussion around resilience is missing vital pieces of information. Today's episode is going to transform the way you understand this whole concept. Dr. Tasha Eurich is an organizational psychologist, researcher, and New York Times bestselling author. She is recognized as the world's leading self-awareness coach and expert in communication. She's also the principal of the Eurich Group, a boutique firm helping executives transform when stakes are high. And her most recent book is Shatterproof: How to Thrive in a World of Constant Chaos and Why Resilience Alone Isn't Enough. Tasha sat down with GLN President and CEO David Ashcraft to talk about her new book. This conversation is important, especially for those of us here desiring to grow in our leadership. Tasha helps us learn that we can actually thrive through our challenges. Tasha and her team have sifted through hundreds and thousands of articles on resilience. They've studied it for years and are now sharing with us how we can reframe life's greatest challenges into our greatest growth opportunities. Let's learn how.
Well, hey, I'm here today with Tasha Eurich. And Tasha, thank you for being here with us at the Global Leadership Network podcast. Appreciate it. I think it's your second time as well.
It is. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, so good to talk to you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. And let me just tell you, you have one of the most impressive bios or resumes. And so I wanted to ask you, and so you're an organizational psychologist, but you've won all kinds of awards as far as the top self-awareness coach, the world's top communication expert, the world's top organizational cultural expert, top 50 world coach, all these titles. And so when you were in high school, what did you think you were going to be? And did all of this hit you by surprise, or how did all this come about?
Well, when I was in high school, I was a giant musical theater nerd. I don't know if I knew what I wanted to do, but I wanted to do something that mattered to me and that gave back to the world. But I went into college, one of the first weeks I was there, I declared my theater major. And it was only later in my college experience that I even discovered that I loved psychology. And then it was kind of an interesting journey from there, because the type of psychology I fell in love with, they didn't actually teach at the school that I went to. So I had to move to New York City in the summer of 2001 to even take an organizational psychology class. And the story as I tell it is exactly what happened, which was, it was this summer school, this kind of summer class that a lot of people probably had to take, but they didn't want to take. And it was taught by this very bored TA. And I remember in the first 5 minutes of that class, sitting there and going, this is what I was meant to do.
Is that right? And so what piece of it caught your eye and kind of captured your heart?
So I'm a fourth generation entrepreneur. Okay. And I was lucky enough to get to literally grow up watching my mom, following her around being a CEO. She started the first the first organization in the country, in the US, that trained and certified nannies to put them in the homes of, single parents or dual earning couples. And I got to see the power of business to transform people and people to transform business. And, it's funny, I actually didn't even put that together until probably 5 years ago. But I think that's where my love of leadership and of business really came from.
So watching her also studying, when you were high school, college, were you leading everybody around at that point, or had you even thought about being a leader yourself or studying leadership?
Well, I've always been a control freak. I've always had a lot of opinions. No, I actually do love leading. Pretty much every opportunity I had to do that in some form, from starting my business at age 10, I think. My best friend was the vice president and I was the president, and we planned children's birthday parties and
Really? Wow, that's
yeah,
pretty
it all
industrious. Yeah.
it kind of went from there. But yeah, I love bringing people together to do amazing things. And now in my career, I get to help other people do that, right? I get to work with CEOs and senior executives and help them make the best positive impact they can.
That's great. Well, I love one of the phrases that I read about you, Tasha, which says she helps people thrive in a changing world by becoming the best of who they are and what they do. And I love that approach of just saying, how do I help people be better? In essence, is that kind of, would you say, the focus of your work and your life?
That's it. I'm inspired by my mentor and adopted dad, Marshall Goldsmith, who says, really my job in any of my interactions and any of my relationships and any of my, consulting engagements is to help make that person's life just a little bit better. And I think we overcomplicate things so much. And at the end of the day, if that's the impact, at least for me personally, I can only speak for myself. If that's the impact that I'm having, I think I'm doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Well, you've been successful as a mentor, as a coach. You've been successful as an author. I know you have a book that just recently came out, correct? And the name is Shatterproof. And if I understand it right, the focus is really helping people through times of chaos or disruption and saying, how do I not just survive that chaos, but how do I actually thrive in the midst of that?
That's correct. Yeah. So, I mean, think about the context that we're living in right now, right? Chaos is accelerating by all objective measures all around us. And what that means for us personally, I think, is, particularly for high achieving people, I call them stressed out strivers, our fellow stressed out strivers. They're seeing this sort of chronic compounding stress across multiple areas of their lives. So we're never just stressed at work. We're never just stressed at home. There's always something coming from multiple places. And, the demands keep rising. And I think, even the most successful people, like the world famous CEOs that I know, as I started this research program about 5 years ago, I was seeing that, there was this sort of facade of I'm fine, but beneath it was, people in various stages of falling apart. And so what I wanted to discover, was what do we do with that, right? If our old tools aren't working, how is it that we can not just survive this craziness that we live in, but find a way to flourish?
So Tasha, describe as a researcher then, where do you even start? Do you start by looking at CEOs, leaders in general, and figuring out what's going on in their lives? Did you start by focusing on stress and how that affects people, or where did you even start in your research for this?
So there were several prongs of our program. It was pretty wide scale. One thing we did was read 1,300 empirical journal articles, so you don't have to. And we looked at, yes, you're welcome. And we looked at the sort of patterns and themes, and we pulled from lots of different areas of literature, but, stress being one of them, and also really looked a lot at the literature on human flourishing, right? What brings out the best in us and what brings out the beast in us. And then also change and sort of how our systems are hardwired to not really deal with the kind of stress we have now. But the way we started, to your question, was we interviewed at a team of about 11 or 12 research assistants. And we stood up this study, this is not a joke, at the beginning of 2020. So January, February, I was training my team on to do this, to start this research program that we casually nicknamed When Bad Things Happen.
So you're the cause of all of this in 2020 is what you're
Well,
starting
I
to say.
think COVID had emerged in China by then, so I can't take full credit.
Okay, all right.
But yeah, it was just, and what was really interesting actually was it made our research questions so much more urgent. We
Yeah.
wanted to understand what are the different ways that people, that working adults, that was kind of our sample all around the world, that they navigated tough times, and what was different about the people that were able to not just kind of bounce back, but to grow forward, to become better,
Yeah.
wiser, stronger. And the answers were pretty surprising.
Is that right? So different than what you expected, but because you said they were surprising. So was it based off of personality types? Was it based off of where the stress was coming from, or what were some of the indicators that you were finding?
So again, fourth generation entrepreneur, resilience devotee. I thought that it was going to be really simple, that the people who were the best off, during and after their crises, whether it was a big or small one, would be more resilient than everyone else. But we actually found that for that small group of people that got better through challenges, they were no more resilient than anyone else. And so that's what led me into the vast currents of resilience literature. I read, I think, like 400 or 500 resilience articles, and we really carefully studied the 52 most highly cited. And what we discovered was that there was so much. It's almost like there's been a game of telephone between what the hardcore academic researchers know about resilience and how it functions and its purpose, and what our popular understanding is. And that was really, it was kind of a rude awakening actually, because I had been, teaching and practicing resilience my entire career. And the good news is we learned that, it does have a time and a place. It is useful, but it can't be our singular coping strategy.
Interesting. So let me ask you real quick before you talk a little bit more then about what you discovered to take us beyond resilience. But Tasha, is it when stress, does it have to be just at work? Or you talked about a variety of places that stress hits us. If somebody's experiencing a lot of stress at work but not at home, or vice versa, does that change the game, or it's just stress in general?
Well, it's interesting because I think no matter where it comes from, the real challenge that humans face, because again, we weren't wired for this, is chronic stress across multiple areas of our lives. And so that could be, 10 stressful things at work. You could have a micromanaging boss and a coworker who's trying to throw you under the bus, and or which is more common in my experience, every area of our lives has something. And I don't know if you find yourself saying this, but like, I did a really dumb thing in my new parking garage over the weekend. I pulled into my space and I hit a big concrete post. And earlier that day, I had said to myself, if one more stressful thing happens, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then, a couple hours later, here we are. Yeah. And that's not a crisis. I mean, it's going to be expensive, but it's not a crisis. But that's the idea, is it's just one thing after another. And we weren't designed to deal with that kind of stress.
So Tasha, again, were there characteristics of people that seem to handle stress better or not? And I'll just real quickly tell you an experience I had maybe 20 years ago in an environment with about 3,000 young adults. The speaker was talking about stress, difficult things in their lives, and then invited people to come up at the end of that time if they felt like they were going through a really stressful, difficult time. And he made it where it seemed like it was pretty narrow that you fit into the parameters of this extreme stress, and invited people to come forward if they were experiencing that. And I would say 95% of the room got up and went forward as though they thought they were experiencing incredible stress. And so it was just fascinating to see that. And so even defining stress a little bit more, or how did you even figure that out in your study?
Well, so I mean, I think it's any constraint that we're experiencing that we don't have control over. That's sort of the way I think about stress is, and there are different types of stress that researchers look at. There's, something called eustress, which is like positive. Ooh, I'm about to give a presentation and I'm feeling a little, keyed up. That sort of isn't the type of stress we're talking about. We're talking about the things that happen to us that are bad, that's a technical term, over which we don't appear to have full control.
Okay.
Right. If something bad happens and we can instantly fix it, usually that doesn't set off the physiological stress response that humans are built to have. So I
Okay.
think uncontrollability or even perceived uncontrollability is a really
Yeah.
big part of it.
That's good. So how do human beings typically respond to that type of stress then? What's the normal response, whether it's good or bad? You could kind of guide us that way, but how would we typically respond?
So there are very, very ancient, hardwired physiological responses that kick in when we perceive stress. And the best example that I can use for our ancestors, right, is you're, sort of walking along a grassland area, and all of a sudden you see a giant tiger. Right? That is stress. That is something bad. That is something that you can't control what that tiger does. So what instantly happens is there's sort of two processes that our body might instantaneously interpret the situation and respond to. So one of them we call fight or flight. That's something that I think a lot of people are familiar with. But what our bodies are doing are releasing very specific stress hormones that are designed to make us either escape or to fight the threat so that we can survive. But in doing that, those stress hormones are also removing our ability to think logically. They are upping all of our systems so that we are not able to be there from a calm place of sort of rational reason. And over time, if they keep getting activated, right? Like, our bodies don't know the difference between a tiger and a stressful email from our boss. So if they keep being activated, it drains the resources we have to cope with stress. So that's kind of the first type of response we can have. Another response, and this is more of a recent discovery by a researcher named Stephen Porges, and he talks about the freeze or faint system. And that's usually when our bodies, and by the way, we don't get to decide which of these responses we choose. Yeah, our body says this is what we're doing. They basically play dead for all intents and purposes. We disassociate. The systems in our body slow down so that if we're going to be attacked by the tiger, we won't be in as much pain. People talk about this feeling of like complete disassociation where, I was in my body, but I wasn't there. And the researcher tells a story about fainting in an MRI machine once, despite feeling no conscious fear. Right. And I think that's so interesting because it goes back to this idea that our bodies decide for us. And just because we have these experiences and these reactions, it doesn't make us weak. It makes us human beings with ancient systems that are designed to sort of, that were helpful to keep us alive before, but are failing us now.
Yeah, interesting. So in essence, you're saying, I don't have control. It's going to happen. Mm-hmm. Are there things predisposed in me, again, based on personality, based on age, based on experience, my upbringing that caused me to lean towards one direction or another in how I respond to stress? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm not an expert in what we would call individual differences in stress responses. But one thing that we do know is people who have had either, kind of early childhood trauma, negative experiences, or just people who have had really stressful lives, right? Because of sort of the station they were born in their lives or the things that have happened to them, it becomes harder to sort of regulate stress. And that goes back to what we were talking about, these myths of resilience. One of the myths that we'll talk about is what doesn't kill us makes us stronger. That's actually not true. What doesn't kill us makes us more vulnerable to the stress that we experience.
So it's not like you build up a resistance to stress. The more you have it, the more you can handle. You're saying it's the exact opposite.
It is. Yeah. I mean, so there's some evidence that if we experience zero stress ever, we're not going to be very resilient. But again, I think by being a person who lives in this world, that's just not something that any of us can claim.
Exactly.
But you're exactly right. More is not better. There's this feeling and this kind of agreed upon wisdom that the more stress we've been through, the stronger we'll get. And that sets us up for a lot of confusion and disappointment.
Yeah, interesting. And can I ask you, is there a difference between stress and chaos? So there could be a lot of things happening around you in life, may not necessarily be stressful, but it may feel stressful because there's so much going on. Are they the same things, or they're not necessarily?
I love your questions. They make me think. I think that chaos is maybe an objective property of the situation, right? Chaos is what's swirling around us, or
Yeah.
change or uncertainty. And then I think stress is, a very common and very understandable response.
Okay. Okay. So as we experience all this stress, then the premise, I think, of what your book is saying, Tasha, is it's not enough to just be resilient and handle that stress, but how do you figure out how to thrive in the midst of that? And so are there steps that we typically don't take that would cause us only to be resilient, or maybe to even, as you just stated a moment ago, kind of go backwards and almost deteriorate more rapidly?
Yes. I introduced the concept in the book called our resilient ceiling. And what that is, kind of going back to what we've been talking about, is sort of the moment our coping resources run out and we reach the upper limit of what we are able to power through or push through. Because that's what resilience teaches us to do, doesn't it? It teaches us to be mentally tough and to be gritty and to just, power through at all costs. This report isn't done. It's 2 a.m. I'm going to be gritty and I'm going to stay up until 4 a.m. And the danger is, we don't know how finite our resilience resources are. So what happens is, to your question, we keep pushing and pushing and pushing, even if we are the strongest, most resilient people ever, right? Who in the past have gotten through everything we've dealt with. There comes a point in almost every high achiever's life where you hit that ceiling. And I actually talk about my experience of that in the book. And it's disorienting because it's like you're fine until the second you're not fine. Another example I'll give you is a CEO I was coaching as I was writing the book, and he was leading this major transformation. It was a super stressful, the board was down his throat and his employees were stressed and he was dealing with some family stuff. And he would always say, "I'm fine." Right? And he would emphasize fine, like gritting his teeth. "I'm fine," because he was being resilient and he was pushing through. And then he called me one day and he said, "So Tasha, kind of embarrassed to admit this, but I was just on a meeting with my team and I started screaming at them for no reason. So I guess I'm not fine." And that's what it feels like when we keep using resilience past the point that we have any of it left.
So describe that, would you, just a little bit more, Tasha? And you said you had an example of yourself even facing that, but it's almost the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. I guess something finally snaps, and then we go into this whole different, is it more different personality, or do we shut down, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so it definitely brings out the worst in us.
Okay.
I'll just say that.
Okay.
But, what happens when we're sort of navigating all these external triggers and we have these stress responses is we do sort of, sometimes it's like a big dramatic thing. But more often in my research, what I see is we break under the weight of a feather. I tell a story in the introduction about a friend of mine named Emily who was dealing with, work stress. She worked in healthcare. She had a big young family. Her husband was having health issues. Her son was being bullied, and she ran into the son's bully and her mom in the parking lot. And it turned into a parking lot mom brawl where they were not physically fighting, but they were playing tug of war with a bag of school supplies, of glitter and glue sticks.
Yeah.
And Emily called me after that and she goes, "I don't know who that person was," right? Who was that person? And I think that's when we know that we are crashing against our resilience ceiling.
So, Tasha, one of the things I've heard people say is it's in those moments you find out who you really are. But I almost think you're implying that's not necessarily the case, or at least it's a different person than who we typically perceive ourselves to be.
Right. So here's what I want to tell everyone who is watching or listening to this unequivocally. If you are a human being and you have a biologically programmed response to something legitimately stressful in your life and you become the worst version of yourself, you are not a failure. You are not a failure of strength. You are not a failure of resilience. You are not a failure of self-awareness. You're experiencing, without being able to control, your automatic responses to sort of a world that our bodies weren't designed to live in. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to remember is our initial responses to this. And I call them shadows in the book, right? Where we sort of get stuck in these self-limiting patterns. That doesn't have to be our destiny. And by the way, that is actually exactly what it means to become shatterproof, which is to sort of trace our pain, to figure out what's triggering us, to understand the needs that aren't being met within us, to understand how we're getting in our way, and then to pivot. And when we pivot, we're not solving all the stress around us, but we're actually finding new ways to get our needs met. And we know that that is the antidote. So when we're crafting our most fundamental needs, it's the antidote to stress. It's when we can flourish, in spite of what's happening to us. It's really fascinating.
Hey everybody, it's Eric. I'm the content producer for the Global Leadership Network podcast, and I have a question for you. What if one event could spark the leader in you? I want to tell you that long before I came to the Global Leadership Network to work, I carved out time every year to attend the Global Leadership Summit so I could get better as a leader and as a person. And just like me, the summit is your chance to gain fresh, actionable leadership insights from world-class speakers like Craig Rochelle, Nick Saban, Christine Kane, and so many more. But here's the deal. On July 16th, your opportunity to get the lowest ticket price comes to an end. So here's what I would say. Don't wait. Join me and thousands of other growth-minded leaders from across the country and around the world at the Global Leadership Summit in 2025. You can go to globalleadership.org/summit and get your ticket today before prices go up. See you there.
Yeah, that's good. So I'd love to ask you, two questions. The second one, but I want to ask you something else first. The second one is, are there signs? Can I tell that this is coming on? Can I tell that I've hit my ceiling, my resilience ceiling, and I'm about to crack? And so are there warning signs that way? But my first question is, I have always, when I've worked with boards or board members that I'm leading or working with, I've always said I want to see those board members before I put them on the board in a stressful situation. And so oftentimes for me, it was we would spend 10 days in Africa or India on some type of emissions project, and there's not food, there's not all the water you want, it's hot, it's sweaty, they're not sleeping well. And then I could see how they responded under stress in that environment, and that helped me feel better of how they would respond in a board meeting. But is my whole premise wrong? Is that kind of what you're saying, or not necessarily?
I don't know. I mean, part of me loves that because of the stakes of board membership, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you have to find the people that can be calm under pressure. But
Right.
maybe one thing I would offer is how many of those people that had negative responses were super strong people,
Yeah.
but that were experiencing so many parts of stress in their lives that it kind of flipped the switch.
Beyond
And
whether they were experiencing there. Yeah.
exactly.
But-
Exactly. And back then we didn't have the book Shatterproof, but
Exactly.
what you could do now is just give those people a copy and then
Good
rerun
point.
the experiment.
Good point. So Tasha, what are some signs? How do I know that I'm about to hit that, or I've hit the ceiling, I'm about to crack?
So 3 signs or 3 clues. The first is lost mojo. And what that means is, you sort of just lose the will to keep all the plates spinning around you. You're like, I have to do this and I have to do this. And you're just, especially things that you used to find like joy or excitement doing it's just not there. You're flat. The second thing is little things feel big. So the example of my friend Emily with the glue sticks, or the example of my CEO with the, kind of minor team issue where we go back and we say, I can't believe I did that in that situation. My response was totally disproportionate. But then the third clue, which I actually think is the most important, is that our top tools are failing. And, we all have different resilience practices. Some people like to practice optimism or gratitude or meditation or yoga or even just, self-care, exercise, sleep, all those things. When we're doing those things and they're starting to feel like piling on instead of providing relief, that's a signal of, wait a minute, I'm trying to replenish a resource that doesn't exist. And then for me, I talk about this in the book where I actually got so intense about this that I made a resilience spreadsheet and I printed it out every day and I would give myself check marks for the practices that I had done. And, pretty soon I realized it wasn't helping me very much. It was actually making it worse. Yeah. So yeah, those are the clues. And I think, the more boxes you check, the closer you probably are.
So I hate to admit, I've experienced all three of those, and I suppose all of us do at some point or another, or is it multiple times in our lives that we experience that?
I mean, yes. So the one thing that I don't have as much data as I want to have is sort of the population level of how close we are to our resilience ceiling. We did just launch a new free resource that maybe we can give your listeners where you can actually assess how close you are to your resilience ceiling.
Yeah.
If they want to see it, it's just resilience-quiz.com. So soon we'll have some more data. But what I found when I do, if I'm doing keynotes or workshops with, kind of successful, high achieving people, I usually find if I ask them, if one is I'm farther away from my resilience ceiling than I could possibly be, and 5 is I'm at it, most people answer 4 and 5 lately. Wow. And, there's always the people I want to study who say 1 or 2, but I think it's more common than we might think.
Yeah, I think so. So is it a misconception that some people can handle more stress than others then? Or, I would like to probably pride myself in thinking I can handle a lot of stress. Or is it just that I don't recognize it or I don't admit it? Or are there variations of how much people can actually withstand?
So the first thing I'll say is the human capacity for resilience can be astounding. Mm-hmm. So, you think about stories of, Viktor Frankl, who spent years in a concentration camp during World War II and was able to mentally transcend that and to use that experience, to help so many people. So I don't want to diminish that. But what also is true is that we all have a limited amount of resilience. Some people have more, some people have less, but we all have a ceiling. And that's where it gets tricky is, as a super type A overachiever myself, the experience of hitting my resilience ceiling wasn't just confusing. It wasn't just disheartening. It felt shameful.
Right.
I have failed, I've been, and I call this grit gaslighting in the book is, we tell ourselves you're stronger than this. You've been through more than this. Why can't you cope right now? Yeah. And so that's why I think it's important for us to remember that this, it's not necessarily something we can control in the way that we've been told. And so when we get there, let's give ourselves some grace. Let's give ourselves some compassion.
No, that's good. So you said when we first started, Tasha, that there are 2 different responses. One is that fight or flight. The other is just kind of shrivel up and die, or however you described it. And so oftentimes I'll watch people and they'll talk about burnout in their lives, or they'll feel as though they're burned out. Is that almost what we're talking about? Or is that a whole different thing? Where people, is that almost the shrivel up and die side of things, where they feel burned out, they just want to quit and roll over and not do anything?
That's a great question. And I think it's important conceptually to distinguish those. Okay. So burnout, there's a couple differences. Burnout is specific to our work.
Okay.
And so what that means is we can be burnt out at work, but not necessarily at our resilience ceiling. If, for example, the other parts of our lives are good. The other thing about burnout that I think is different from hitting our resilience ceiling is burnout develops, more gradually, right? It's like over time, you keep doing it. Whereas hitting your resilience ceiling can feel like this sudden experience where, I always say like you're fine until the second you're not.
Yeah.
Now, does that mean that you can't be burnt out and hitting your resilience ceiling? No, and that would be bad, right? But I think they're sort of independent in that way.
Yeah. Okay, good. And it's not like you can build up a resilience muscle then. Or is that even possible?
So it's one of the myths of resilience. It's the second myth of resilience, that resilience is completely under our control to improve. And I'll tell you two things. So the first we already mentioned, which is that some people, because of the things that have happened to them through no fault of their own, have less resilience, right? And it doesn't mean they have no resilience, but they can't sustain it over time in the same way. But what I think is even more fascinating is there have been a bunch of they're called meta-analyses, which means like a study of all the studies. And they get, 40,000 data points, and they look at it and they say, what is really going on here? And what researchers have found is that interventions to improve resilience, so think about like at your workplace, or even trying to, learn how to cognitively reframe the stress that's happening in your life. Some meta-analyses show that they help a little, and that means going from a 1 to a 2 and not a 1 to a 10. Some show that they don't have any effect. And then some, including what I think is the most compelling and statistically sound study, shows people have worse psychological well-being after these resilience interventions. And there's a lot of, I'm curious. So you're smiling knowingly.
Well, almost like it's depressing or discouraging to think, what's the point then? So, yeah.
Right. Well, now that we know all of this, right? So, but you think about like, I tell a story in the book of a nurse who is super mad that she has to go through this resilience training with her company, because instead of adding more nurses, they are making their short-staffed nurses go through this resilience program because the problem is them. The problem isn't the system, right? So there's so much in that, but I think knowing that we shouldn't be punishing ourselves for whatever our limit of resilience is, I think is the takeaway.
So switch perspectives, and maybe Tasha, from an employer side, because you mentioned a work environment. So what can we be doing as leaders to help people that are followers or employees or whatever, family members, however you want to describe it? Should we be dealing with people differently? You just described the training isn't necessarily helping. So
Right. And yeah, there's actually a bunch of work on that. If you Google like Harvard Business Review and resilience training, there's a lot of really good stuff there. And I think what it boils down to is, in some sense, we might be overcomplicating this. And obviously, employee well-being and flourishing and performance, it's not a simple topic. But I'm working on actually a bonus chapter that's going to be available online for the book, where I talk about something called need fueling leadership. And I think I mentioned this earlier, that humans, we have ingrained psychological needs. And the three fundamental needs that everyone, no matter where you are in the world, no matter, what your life looks like, you're programmed to seek three things. Number one is to feel confident, to feel like we're doing well, we're capable, we're growing. Two is choice, which is really a feeling of agency, of authenticity. We can be who we are. And then the third is connection. And that is kind of belonging, mutual support, mutual warmth. And what I think leaders can do that cuts through so much of the complexity of leadership is to start by asking, what am I doing? And also, what's the system around me doing that's either fulfilling or frustrating those three needs?
Interesting. In the people that are following us or working for us or even in ourselves, I guess.
Exactly. Well, and the whole kind of arc of Shatterproof is how do we transcend the limitations of our environment and build those needs in ourselves? But you're absolutely right. Any type of leader. You could be a CEO, you could be a first line leader, you could be an informal leader, you could be leading a school project, you could be a parent, right? All of those things, if we just say, how am I helping the people whose potential I'm trying to bring out feel capable, feel a sense of agency, feel a sense of connection? I think it's I'm actually writing a piece for Harvard Business Review about this right now, actually. And it's something that I think it's almost like we need to go back to basics.
Yeah, yeah. And is it worse in today's culture than it was 100 years ago because everything is moving so much faster, or not necessarily?
Well, I'm not an expert on what work looked like 100 years ago. I know enough to be dangerous. I do think that work is less transactional now, right? So we've sort of gone over to this other end of your work must be the most meaningful thing that you do versus, you show up at the factory and you put in your 8 hours.
Right.
But I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, good. So you've hit the resilience ceiling, and we don't want to just be resilient. We want to actually thrive beyond that. So can you give us what that looks like in just a nutshell of what does it mean to thrive beyond just being resilient?
So becoming shatterproof is a second skill set that can complement resilience. So we're not leaving resilience behind, but we're realizing that maybe it's not going to do everything that we think it's going to do for us. So what becoming shatterproof means, just at a most basic fundamental level, is moving away from white knuckling through stress, resiliently white knuckling, and using our toughest moments to proactively transform ourselves. And more specifically, what that means is, and this is very different than resilience, instead of ignoring our pain and our cracks and the things that are making us want to, stop or give up, we're actually using our cracks to point us towards how we can be better, stronger, wiser, and braver. And a good analogy that I just love, that a client of mine told me about, is the Japanese art of kintsugi. Have you heard of this?
I don't know.
It's this ancient art in Japan of repairing broken objects, right? Usually pottery, with precious metal. So you imagine a broken bowl. Becoming shatterproof allows us to break because that's the world we live in. If we're saying that we're not breaking ever, we are probably not in touch with what's really going on with us, right? So what becoming shatterproof means is taking those broken pieces and fusing them together with something stronger so that the cracks become features instead of flaws. And really the way into that, and at a very, very high level, it means instead of sort of running away from and powering through everything that's going on internally in stress, we are acutely examining it. And we're making different decisions about how to move away from those self-limiting behaviors and how to pivot to kind of new ways of getting those 3 needs met. And that was what we found in our research program. That was what that small group was doing differently. They weren't any more resilient, but they had this mindset and this practice of harnessing their toughest moments to proactively transform themselves.
So I think you just answered what was going to be my last question. I was going to say, so if I take the research that you have provided us and the findings and your conclusions, and I put them into practice to be shatterproof, how would I look different in that situation than before I actually went through the content and material and tried to apply it in my situation?
So you would, at a minimum, instead of saying, I am not okay and I am falling apart, you would be saying, this isn't the best moment of my life, but I feel empowered to manage it, right? So that's the baseline, worst case scenario. In the best case scenario, you're actually building a better life. You're feeling better. you're doing better, you're living better. Because at the heart of this is, right, you start with all the bad stuff that's going on around you, but you use that bad stuff to find, maybe we reference Bill North and Bill George with True North and sort of your compass. Like, what are the things that I need to be of service to others and to build a good life, so that I can kind of navigate these moments with a lot more grace and a lot more confidence and a lot more wisdom. And to me, that's what true strength is, right?
Yeah, that's good.
It's not saying that we're not breaking. It's saying I'm breaking and I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that to become the best version of myself.
That's great. I love that. Tasha, I love the content because, again, it's something we all experience more often than we want to admit. And so I think it's just very practical and real helpful. And even just your description of what I may become or a person may become by putting some of these practices into their lives, I think that's huge. So I'm excited for people to get a hold of this content. And I'm excited for you to be speaking at the summit this year. I think that's going to be excellent. And for our summit crowd to be able to hear you and learn from you, I think it's fantastic. If people want to get a hold of, again, your content or learn more, and you mentioned a resource earlier as we were talking, do you mind repeating that, and then just ways to get a hold of you and in touch with you?
Happy to. Well, I always say I'm everywhere, whether I want to be or not. So I'm very findable. Last name is spelled Eurich, first name Tasha. And then the web address is resilience-quiz.com. Okay. And what it tells you is how close are you to your resilience ceiling. You can even get somebody who knows you well to provide their responses, which is totally optional. And then you get kind of a step-by-step plan about what to do about it based on your specific results.
That's great. That'd be fun for people at the summit to take that. I don't know if it's before or after, but that'd be a great thing for people to see. And
let's throw down the challenge maybe. Yeah, if you're listening to this before the summit, take it, print it, bring it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that'd be great. Very cool. Tasha, thank you for the time. Thank you for your work and your research. I think it's going to be very helpful for people, in addition to all the other things that you've done that have already been very helpful, but appreciate you doing this work. And thank you for talking with us.
You're too kind, David. Thank you. It was great to be here.
Thank you, Tasha.
Hey again, friends. I don't know about you, but this episode came at the perfect time for me. As leaders, we are all facing different challenges. This season, I am finding myself in a place with lots of decisions to navigate, and maybe you are too. I'm grateful Tasha has given us tools to not only grin and bear it, but also ask ourselves, how can my toughest moments be used to transform me? I personally wrote down 3 words that she shared. They were confidence, choice, and connection. And then I started asking myself, what am I doing that is fulfilling or frustrating those needs? I'll say them again. They are confidence, choice, and connection. And then the question that we ask ourselves is, what am I doing that is fulfilling or frustrating those needs? You guys, if we spend some time asking ourselves these key questions, then we are on the pathway of transforming hard things into good. And listen, you know that you help us get the word out about tools and resources like this when you leave us a review. So would you let us know what you are learning and leave a 5-star review if this episode has been helpful for you? That also helps us get the word out about this community. And you guys, do not forget the Global Leadership Summit is coming up, and you can get your best rate right now. I want you to imagine if you brought your team and sat under Tasha's teaching together, and the impact it could make not only on you, but on your entire organization. Head to globalleadership.org to get your lowest rate today. That's globalleadership.org to get your lowest rate today. Thanks for joining us. I am so glad you are part of this community, because we know that when the leader gets better, everyone wins.